Yeah, welcome everyone. Yeah, it seems incredible, but Nicolai too is moving into the last phase of his PhD project entitled Cinematic Waesthetics, Waste and Environmental Affect in Contemporary Cinema and Film. So today we'll have another thesis seminar where we'll discuss some of the work that Nicolai has already done and some of the work that remains to be done for him to proceed towards his PhD defense. And to help us out, we have as our respondent John Parham, who is professor of environmental humanities at the University of Worcester in the UK. John is, what shall I say, a pioneering and a leading eco-critic who has published widely on Victorian literature, ecomedia, environmental popular culture. I'll just mention his book, Green Media and Popular Culture from 2016. And he's also the co-editor of a very fine journal, Green Letter, Studies in Ecocriticism. And John also has a lot of experience with PhD supervision and assessment. So we're super happy that he could help us out and be the respondent here today. So we have a little more than an hour, and we'll proceed much as we did in the previous session. So first, Nicolai will give a presentation, and then after that, John will take over and respond, and this will develop into a dialogue. And towards the end, I hope we should try to make time for some questions from other participants or panelists. Okay. All right. Thank you. Over to you, Nicolai.
All right. Well, hi everyone, and thank you all for showing up for this thesis seminar, and thank you, John, for lending your time and your expertise here and giving some feedback on the project. I really do appreciate it. So for this brief presentation, I'm going to try to sort of offer an introduction to my dissertation in its current state, and this will include some thoughts on the theoretical frameworks, and I'll include just sort of a brief summary of the articles that will be included in the dissertation. But before I sort of like get into the nitty-gritty of it, I'm just going to show you a brief overview of what my dissertation looks like currently. So here you see a preliminary table of contents for my project, which, as some of you will be aware, takes the form of an article-based dissertation, meaning that instead of putting together a monograph with chapters, I will be compiling a series of academic articles. Now, in a nutshell, the aim of my PhD project, which has the preliminary title Cinematic Waesthetics, is to explore the aesthetic representation of waste in cinema, film, and television, and to sort of, in turn, try to reflect on the ecological and cultural significance of those very representations. And I do this through the five case studies that you see here, each of which engages with a different aspect or problem related to the representation of waste in its different forms. And I'll get back to each of these by the end of the talk. The last thing I just want to note is that presently I have about 6 months left to finalize the dissertation. And so I guess what I really want to get out of this thesis seminar is some feedback that will help me sort of bring my project together in a more holistic sense, and of course to address some of the shortcomings that you think I might have failed to recognize. So I have divided my talk into 3 short bits here. First, I'm going to offer a few words of reflection on some of the broader societal concerns that motivate the project. Second, I'll offer an ultra brief overview of the theoretical frameworks that I draw upon in the research. And then finally, I'll offer an overview of the 5 articles highlighting some of their key findings and methods. So part 1, why waste? In a way, the answer is as simple as the question itself. We should engage with the subject of waste because waste matters. In an era of anthropogenic climate change and mass extinction, waste has become one of the central environmental issues of our time. Whether it be in the form of plastic pollution or CO2 emissions or radioactive fallout, Waste appears more than ever before to be everywhere. Waste today saturates every corner of the earth in quantities that are both ever increasing and, importantly, ever more difficult to encapsulate. With the advent of the anthro-capitalocene, growing bodies of waste have also become hotspots of socio-ecological tension. With rising piles of e-waste in the global south, the pressing issues of waste transcend our borders, places, and nations, whilst at the same time serves to strengthen global socio-economic disparities and distinctions. And yet, dealing with waste mostly seems to us a waste of time. Waste is often seen as something inert, dead, and pliable that we as humans can discard without further consequences. Simply put, when it comes to waste, the out of sight, out of mind mentality has usually been the name of the game. Now, my PhD project is about the ways film can transform and modulate this attitude to waste. By foregrounding the varied aesthetics of waste in film, the project explores the potential of moving images and shaping our experiences of and attitudes toward waste. And as such, my main hypothesis is that film as an audiovisual medium can give us a sensuous access to a register of affective experiences of waste that hold the potential to mobilize changes in the material, social, and perceptual ecologies of waste in the Anthropocene. Now, this hypothesis, in turn, gives rise to a range of unexplored sub-questions concerning the film medium, the film experience, and the relationship between film, society, and the environment. How is waste represented in contemporary film? What function might waste in film serve in terms of narrative, spectacle, and symbolism? By what means does waste in film generate affective and emotional experience? And in what ways might film change the material and social world? And how might, if at all, such interactions be investigated? Part 2. Theoretical frameworks. So I've tried to illustrate my overall theoretical framework in the form of 3 overlapping fields of theory that you see here. These are ecocriticism/ecomedia, new materialism, and waste studies. Now, I don't want to take up too much time with this opening presentation, so what I'll do for this section specifically, just to provide a few brief comments on how I make use of these respective fields in my work. So first of all, in the project, I draw on the field of new materialism, which is an interdisciplinary area of scholarship that can be defined by its attention to processes of materialization more generally, and importantly, the implications of such processes within society and culture at large. As with any interdisciplinary field, however, it can be difficult to sort of synthesize its many voices into a single cohesive theory that I may then somehow apply, as it were, in my analytical work. But nevertheless, 2 assumptions drawn from within this field have been with me as I've attempted to sort of think through the significance of waste as a material process and as an aesthetic object. The first assumption is that waste, precisely because it is material, holds an affordance to affect the world around it. And this statement ultimately is another way of saying that waste on some level has agency. And now the strange thing about this assumption is that it is at once obscure and self-evident. On the one hand, the idea that waste has agency seems radically counterintuitive. Trash objects, such as plastic bags, are nothing like us. They cannot will something to happen. They seem to lack this sort of phenomenological intentionality that we tend to associate with the idea of agency. On the other hand, when considering the impact that waste has on more than human ecosystems, its agency, I would claim, becomes rather palpable. Consider, for instance, the increasingly frequent reports about whales washing up ashore with their stomachs filled with marine plastic debris. In such cases, waste seem anything but passive. Rather, they seem like like an active material, and in this case, a very lethal accent that gives rise to processes of species extinction, to environmental pollution, and ultimately to climate change. The second assumption that I bring with me from this field is perhaps less controversial, which is that waste, like all matter, cannot and should not be taken as a discrete entity, but rather as deeply entangled within human and more than human worlds and contexts. That is to say, waste needs to be understood relationally as an entity that cannot be disconnected from the specific socioeconomic context it emerges from. Ontologically, waste traverses dichotomies of nature and culture as it travels across ecological circuits and in and out of bodies, both human and non-human. And so taken together, these two assumptions thus form the ontological basis of my examination of waste, which I define as a particular form of material excess capable of moving beyond human control and across anthropocentric boundaries. The second major field of theory that informs my project is waste studies, a field of critical inquiry that studies the role of waste in society, both today and historically. Like new materialism, however, this field represents a vast and heterogeneous landscape that hosts scholars from a variety of disciplines, from anthropology to history, sociology to economics and law, geography, archaeology, design, philosophy, and so on and so forth. But for the purposes of my PhD, I've drawn in particular on scholarship that discusses the epistemological, the aesthetic, and the social dimensions of waste. And I could go on at length about all of these different works, but I want to mention specifically Mary Douglas's Purity and Danger, in which she famously proclaimed that dirt, much like waste, is matter out of place. And in doing so, Douglas laid forth a constructivist ontology, which held that what comes to be perceived as waste is never fixed. Rather, it is the product of historical circumstance, of cultural systems, codes, values, and so on and so forth. And now, while I'm certainly very sympathetic to Douglas's constructivist relativism, it seems to me to only represent half the truth, as it leaves out the sort of unruly, unpredictable dimensions of its non-human agency that I just described earlier. Such unpredictability, however, is the topic of Maurizio Boscaglia's stuff theory, which theorizes that it is precisely the fluidity of garbage, that is, its defiance of categorization, that lends waste its disruptive power. In considering how waste is presented in contemporary art and in film, Boscaglia pays close attention to how the sort of radical alterity of waste may facilitate epistemological jolts that can take on ecological dimensions. Finally, Gay Hawkins' Ethics of Waste, The Ethics of Waste has been a guiding voice throughout my project. Hawkins' work examines how our relational ties and ways of living with waste are not only regulated by sort of these disciplinary discourses, as seen, for instance, in the case of the all too familiar environmental campaign video. Rather, she claims that our ways of living with waste is to a large extent something that we maintain through embodied habits and affective dispositions. In turn, Hawkins claims that in order to mobilize more sustainable ways of living with the sort of inevitability of transience and decay, interventions such as those offered in film may indeed have to rest on affective rather than moralizing means of doing so. And so this brings me to the final theoretical pillar of the project, namely ecocriticism and/or ecomedia. So often motivated by an ethical or political agenda, ecocriticism has been compared to the projects of post-colonial theory and feminist theory as it examines critically how various discourses and artworks might serve to challenge or reproduce these sort of entrenched and destructive modes of thinking. So in this sense, a commonly held assumption within the field is precisely that in order to respond to the existential socio-ecological challenges that we're facing today, we need new narratives of who we are, how we're entangled in the rest of the world, and how we might think and feel and act to sort of like preserve a stable biosphere and a livable future. In my project, I like to think that I exhibit a fair degree of moderation with regards to such claims, because on the one hand, I do, of course, pay close attention to moments of possibility where the perceptual dynamics of anthropocentrism become destabilized, as seen, for instance, in the TV series Chernobyl, which offers an intense encounter with this sort of more than human force of radiation. But on the other hand, it is important not to overstate the power of such audiovisual texts. For instance, there's a number of reasons for this, of course, but one primary reason is that when considering the sort of mass consumption of the media products that I do consider in the project, it's important to recognize the ways in which film and media are also caught up in this sort of overarching logics of globalized capitalism, which at the end of the day has been and continue to be responsible for much of the ecological destruction that the films themselves in a way call attention to. Right, let me see where I got in my notes. Right, and so I guess this is only one issue that faces this broader field. There are heaps of other related issues, which in turn could be stuff like problems of overexposure of these sorts of narratives, or problems of compassion fatigue, and sort of these more paradoxical problems of commodifying apocalyptic narratives, all of which speak to the issue specifically of waste in contemporary film. Now, ecomedia in turn refers to this sort of sub-branch of ecocriticism that focuses specifically on the representation of environmental issues in non-print media, such as film and television and popular culture more generally. So my effort to sort of try to contribute to this particular field of study is precisely in trying to show how some of these eco-critical concepts, such as Rob Nixon's slow violence and Stacey Alaimo's transcorporality and Serenella Iovino and Sir Loberman's storied matter, may somehow be translated into a film analytical context. And so we come full circle of the three fields of theory that inform much of the work that I've done so far. And so before I finish up here, allow me to just provide an ultra brief tour de force through some of the work that I have written. So this is part 3, a few examples, and I'll wrap it up in just a moment. So to return to my table of contents, we here find 5 case studies that each engages with a different question concerning the audiovisual representation of waste in ecomedia. In the first article, I explore the connections that tie together science fiction as a genre of cognitive estrangement and the varied forms of waste that have come to permeate the genre's filmic depictions of the future. By looking at the 3 films that you see here, the article proposes that waste in contemporary sci-fi can be seen to operate mainly within 3 overlapping modes that are referred to as wasted worlds, wasted lives, and becoming waste. In making this distinction, I draw extensively on Adrian Ivakiv's description of cinema as an anthro-bio-geomorphic machine, which emphasizes that cinema embodies 3 principal affordances. It builds worlds, it facilitates experiences of subjectivity, and it mediates processes of becoming. Using this model, I then try to unravel the aesthetic, affective, and epistemological significance that characterizes waste in contemporary sci-fi. In Idiocracy, for instance, we experience a future Earth that is literally covered in the waste of our historical present. Waste, in other words, is here used as a distinct form of world building that connects our historical present with its future demise, thus offering a cognitive link between the cinematic novum and the world of the viewer. In turn, I show how this estrangement engendered by these cinematic environments invite viewers to re-examine the detrimental effects of consumer culture and globalized capitalism. Turning to Blade Runner 2049, we see here a form of waste that does not merely serve as a dynamic backdrop for a narrative about a failed future. Here, waste also exposes the processes by which some human beings are forced to live in and as the waste of society. By paying close attention to one scene in particular taking place in the so-called trash mesa, I show how the film reflects concern about the human cost of electronic waste disposal, as it situates these sort of sweatshop worlds of child laborers commonly associated with the iconography of the global south within the periphery of a future California dystopia. Finally, I look to District 9 in order to make tangible the strange connection that seemed to exist between waste and processes of transformation. Focusing especially on the Kafkaesque metamorphosis of the protagonist, I demonstrate the ways in which waste as a kind of radical formlessness can serve to aid the filmic depiction of change. In turn, such processes, I claim, take on an ethical dimension as it comes to unsettle otherwise given anthropocentric distinctions, such as those posed between human and animal, between subject and object, between self and other. In my second article, I turn to the representation of the radioactive fallout. Here I present a comparative analysis of HBO's miniseries Chernobyl and Svetlana Alexievich's literary testimonies, Voices from Chernobyl, The Oral History of a Nuclear Disaster, both of which represent the events and the aftermath of the Chernobyl nuclear accident in 1986. As a case study in what scholars have referred to as intermediate ecocriticism, the comparative study investigates the ability of each media product to make perceptible the forces of radiation, focusing in particular on what it feels like to inhabit the atmospheres of contamination that the two media products invite their viewers and their readers to enter. In the article, I argue that both works employ a sort of type of what I call indexical aesthetics, but that the choice in index differ depending on the modality of the media product. Whereas the miniseries constructs a rich soundscape and striking images of bodily decay, Voices from Chernobyl provides instead a polyphony of first-person testimonies about the dehumanizing experiences of radiation exposure. By comparing the two media products in terms of the experiences they create through these strategies, the study thus illustrates the varying affordances of literary and audiovisual media for representing the phenomenon of radiation and the consequences of nuclear disaster more generally. My third article, entitled Screening Waste, an Empirical Reception Study of the Environmental Documentary Plastic China, was written in an attempt to sort of try to contribute to the emerging field known as empirical ecocriticism, which has been described by figures such as Scott Slovic as marking what might become a fifth wave of ecocritical inquiry, marked by an intention to put our readings to the test, so to speak. The article reports the findings of an explorative and qualitative reception study of the observational documentary Plastic China, a film that portrays the social and environmental consequences of the international plastic recycling industry in China. And so the interviews found that a number of scenes and narrative features had caught the attention of the participants. They described feeling apprehensive toward the toxic environment that makes up the backdrop of the film. They also describe feeling sympathetic for the recycling workers who are forced to live in it. And they explained feeling troubled by the fact that they would actually recognize many of the waste objects from their everyday lives in Denmark. And in discussing these responses, the chapter employs Stuart Hall's encoding-decoding model of communication to illustrate how the individual variation within the collective corpus of viewer testimonies could be made sense of through three principal subject-viewer positions: the dominant hegemonic, the negotiated, and the oppositional. In doing so, the chapter tries to demonstrate one way in which empirical ecocritics might utilize the sort of qualitative framework from audience reception studies as a means to not only evaluate the actual capacity for an environmental documentary to communicate complex ecological issues, but more importantly, also to identify some of the obstacles that are involved in such an effort from the perspective of the viewer, of course. My fourth article, entitled Humor and Ecomedia, examines the use of humor in contemporary environmental short films about waste. The article responds to ongoing debates within the environmental humanities about the immobilizing effects of apocalyptic rhetoric and the sort of growing antipathy toward the didacticism of crisis discourse, suggesting that humor as a representational strategy presents a promising alternative to the to the confining strictures of mainstream environmentalist discourse. The more critical intervention of the article is derived from the observation that different types of environmental humor, and notably I engage with irony and satire here, these different types have profound impacts on the potential of this comedic mode as a way of moving beyond the aforementioned restrictions. And so here I compare the two short films, The Majestic Plastic Bag with Finding Beauty in Garbage, and I show how irony, as opposed to satire, may appear more suited for engaging viewers that would otherwise be put off by the finger-wagging tendencies of conventional environmentalist discourse. And this distinction is based on the observation that environmental satire may, despite its efforts to try to sort of be playful, retain a fairly explicit degree of moralism that prevents such films from moving beyond its conventional registers. By contrast, irony, I claim, may, through its incongruities, offer itself as an effective vehicle for conveying new ecological modes of noticing. So the fifth and final article that I am still in the process of writing, I engaged with the recent Netflix documentary Seaspiracy, which since its release earlier this year has been the subject of wide debate amongst marine conservationists and environmental activists. My engagement with this film takes notice of a growing trend to use the concept of conspiracy as a storytelling device for environmental filmmakers, as for instance also seen in the other films by the same producer, Kip Anderson, who directed and starred in the similarly named documentaries Cowspiracy and What the Health. And so in this article, I wish to try to think through some of the implications that this form of conspiratorial storytelling might have for contemporary environmentalist discourse. Because inasmuch as Tibrizzi, that's the guy you see here who stars and directs the film, inasmuch as this film does offer a welcome contribution to the effort of bringing the issue of ocean degradation to the public's attention, and even though the film also appears to have been successful in doing so, as it soon became one of the most streamed documentaries on the platform, it also promotes, I argue, a distorted, if not reductive concept of environmental accountability that sort of villainizes individual environmental organizations for problems that are, to a large extent, structural in nature. And so what Seaspiracy sort of makes crystal clear is that stories of conspiracy are indeed highly engaging, but whether they're also educating is a question that I think remains to be answered. And so this is the question that I take up in this final article. And so this concludes my opening presentation. I hope this has provided with you with at least a somewhat tangible idea of my dissertation, including its methods, aims, and scope, and so on. And as mentioned in the beginning, I have about 6 months left to finish the dissertation. And this also means that the next project for me will be to compose this introduction in the beginning of the PhD that's going to do two things. It's going to synthesize the argument that runs through the various articles, and B, to situate the research within its broader disciplinary context. And so I welcome all of you to contribute with feedback that you think might be helpful for me to bringing the project to a close in this regard. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Nicolai. And now let's hear from Professor John Parham, our respondent.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Nicolai. That was fascinating and illuminating on top of what I've already read, Nicolai, of your work. And there's a lot to think about here, but I've got this sort of crystallized into a few main points, I hope. The first thing I'd like to say, though, is I really like this dissertation. I think it's outstanding in places. And some things really jump out about it. I really like the way, and this came across in your presentation as well as what I read earlier. I really like the way you seem to be crossing all areas of media studies, eco-media studies, and indeed cultural studies, the way you move into humour, for example. It shows a really good grasp of the field. And I think what also comes out really clearly was something which jumped out at me, and it comes across in your images, is the ubiquity of waste in films. Just how many films there are in which you see these kinds of images of waste as a kind of, a sort of portent of the future, during and beyond the Anthropocene. And, to a point where, your example is well chosen. You're sort of thinking, well, there's lots of other obvious examples, which you do mention in passing, like Wall-E, for example, where it's there in the first half-hour film and what have you. And in a more sort of practical, pragmatic form, I just thought this was really good as a piece of writing as well. Your work is highly readable. You're able to condense and explain other people's theories really well. I hope this came across to other people as well, because I certainly feel it. The structure of what you've put together here is extremely well structured, really well organized. You can see very clearly how the chapters all kind of work off one another and sort of build towards a kind of overall argument. So it's all looking really good. But obviously, I do have some points to raise on top of that as well. So I'm going to start by some sort of general points and then sort of work towards a kind of more specific, if that's all right. I mean, do you want me to sort of present as earlier in sort of, 10 minutes or so of me talking about my feelings about it? And then
that sounds great.
Right, lovely. That's brilliant.
Thank you.
So I'll start with a general. There is a wider context to your PhD, at least if I understand it correctly, which is of using waste as a theme which is kind of indicative of a wider crisis of the Anthropocene, the moment we find ourselves in, and the questions it raises about how we're going to work through it, if we can work through it. But of course, there are other indicators of the Anthropocene, as you see in the sort of debates around the various kind of golden spikes for things which can denote this moment of the Anthropocene as something real. So I was curious. I mean, you did address this to some extent at the beginning of your presentation, but I still wanted to know a bit more. I was curious as to why you've chosen to focus on waste when there are other markers of the Anthropocene, such as pollution, which I know in some ways overlaps with waste, extinction, CO2 levels, those kinds of things. What is it? Can waste take us somewhere in our thinking about the Anthropocene that perhaps some other things can't? So I was kind of interested in that. And as a kind of mirror image of that point, I was kind of interested in your choice of film also. You make the point, again, this was very near the beginning of your presentation today, you make the point quite correctly that film is an immersive medium. And therefore, I think what you're arguing is that it immerses us in these questions and therefore forces us to confront our own complicity, our own involvement, our own responsibility in relation to the Anthropocene. But of course, there are other immersive media as well. Not many people have written about this, but there's a bit of work about radio drama, for instance, which in the sort of enclosed and confined space in which you listen to radio drama, that can be highly immersive. One could argue, and I have to be honest, I've not yet made my own mind up about this. One could argue that something like computer games is an even more immersive media than film, because you're actually there playing it, enacting it. With improving technology, it's become a complete, increasingly haptic experience playing computer games. So you could argue that gaming is an even more immersive experience than film. So I would like to hear you say a bit more about why the focus on film as opposed to another form of media. Not that I dispute it, I just like to know more. And I think, it's something that would be helpful for you to pin down, as it would with the question of waste in the introduction you were talking about at the end of your presentation. I think you're right to suggest that the role of waste in film is still something which is under research to some extent, but you do identify, you've done some good literature reviewing here, you do identify some of the writers who've addressed this area, people like Tina Kendall and Xie-Ju Chang in particular. And I just wondered what your arguments offer, which other writers haven't offered already, particularly names like this who focused very closely on the same areas as you. In other words, a good PhD question, you know, what, if you have to pin it down, what is your original contribution to knowledge? Okay, and I wanted then to sort of delve down into a bit more of the detail of your PhD. For the benefit of others listening into this, what I've looked at closely in particular is the opening chapter on science fiction film and the representation of waste. Although what I really liked about your presentation is how clearly you managed to link it to other things. Reading your analysis of the films that you were talking about earlier, District 9, 2049, the Blade Runner film, Idiocracy, there's a slight sense in which the PhD is possibly pulling in two directions, because 2049 and Idiocracy are very much, you know, you use these films very much to sort of make a critique of where our contemporary first world society, you can use those terms, is taking us, and a critique about, as I've already mentioned, our complicity as viewers in the Anthropocene issues it raises. And then you talk about District 9, and you talk about really interestingly, because you could see that very much as a sort of social film as well, and the analogies to race and what have you. But you talk really interestingly about how it takes us into these philosophical questions which blur the line between the human and the non-human. And you say in your analysis of District 9, waste becomes a marker of hybridity, challenging established anthropocentric modes of cognition, and signalling the conditions for a possibility of change. And I was interested in hearing a bit more about the relationship between those two things, between, you know, film as kind of critique and film as a sort of more philosophical enterprise, which blurs the line between the humans and non-humans, and how that helps us to answer some of the questions that the more critical films raise. Does that make sense? Lovely, good. Thank you. And the other thing I'm really interested in, not least because it's an area which I've been kind of dipping in and out of for the last few years, is humour, which you mentioned. It's really good to see humour in the PhD. In fact, it's really good to see reception studies in the PhD as well. That's another point. You argued really compellingly just now in the presentation about the importance of using irony rather than satire, or the possible greater sort of scope of using irony rather than satire, which I absolutely do agree with you. I find satire problematic, because if you just attack people and their lifestyles and their, you know, their consumerism and so on, you end up with estrangement and people switching off from a message. What I was a bit confused about, though, was that in your analysis of Idiocracy, you say that Idiocracy relies on satire, irony, and hyperbole to create an effective dynamic of distance that estranges viewers from the irrational behaviour of a Western consumer. But of course, these Western consumers are watching Idiocracy. So if they're being estranged from these things, how does it then kind of engage them into it? Or is this something more specific about Idiocracy, which differs from the examples of humour that you use in the later films in, I think it's chapter 4, isn't it? So if you could say something about that, I'd be grateful. And finally, I mean, I do have a few questions, but I'll end it, I think, by talking about another central question, I think, here is, your PhD is very good at sort of bringing together all the different dimensions of film, and particularly amplifying the sort of affective dimension of film. You talk very compellingly about spectacle and narrative in the parts of the PhD I've read. The images you showed, well, I suppose it's a visual presentation, so they would be. The images you showed dwelt much more on the sort of visual spectacle aspect. So I just wondered if this isn't a too crude a question, do you see one as more significant than the other in terms of how these films get across a message about waste? Are they, you know, so it's an age-old question in kind of film studies, I think. are they principally texts of spectacle, which kind of sort of shock us into confronting these issues? Or does a narrative play a major role? Or I suppose a better question is how do spectacle and narrative connect together? Taking them in conjunction, what work are they doing? And I think there's plenty there, Nicolai. So I'll leave you to pick up some of those points, if I may.
Yeah, thank you, John. And thank you for all the kind words. So many things to to respond to. I think I made 6 bullet points here that you voiced. But yeah, thank you for the kind words in the beginning as well. It definitely what you described in terms of this observation of waste being sort of ubiquitous, not only in I guess physically or environmentally, but also in popular media, was exactly what spurred the motivation to engage with this topic. This sort of noticing of constant presence of waste in all these different genres and different sort of types of media products. It sort of has this ubiquitous presence that's never really engaged with systematically. Anyways, I would say. Your first question about sort of an extension of that, looking into waste as this sort of indicator for the Anthropocene. Myra Hurd has described waste as the signifier of the Anthropocene. But of course, such statements also need to be critically examined, right? Of course, for me, my whole world is filled with waste these days. So I see it everywhere, and I really do see it as a central sort of phenomenon or topic or concept through which we might sort of understand some of the larger ecological calamities. But I definitely think you're right that waste would have to, probably in the introduction as well, be sort of like situated alongside a lot of the other indications, such as that you mentioned yourself in terms of extinction and pollution. The first thing I thought was, as you brought up those 2 specific examples, is that again, the waste comes across as this sort of like master concept in a way. But maybe it's just the delusions of a doctoral student just writing about waste. The waste seems to implicate anything, but pollution is sort of like, I guess, as both an ecological concept, but also as a trope, fundamentally embedded in logics of cleanliness and sort of these rituals of policing of certain distinctions that waste can come to undo. And in that sense, could see pollution as not only an indication alongside waste, but perhaps a symptom of the category of waste in and of itself. And extinction as well, as I sort of tried to allude to in the film Albatross, or the picture from the film Albatross, with the film at Midway with all of these different processes of species extinction happening, being so closely linked to waste as well, in terms of the whether it be in form of microplastic or in terms of beached whales and so on and so forth. So I think in response to your challenge, or whatever you could call it, in terms of the other indications, I think maybe I would maintain that waste still remains sort of a central concept, insofar as the other phenomena can be in a way explained and related back through the overarching context of waste. So that's I think what I would say about your first question. Your second question is concerning this notion of choice of medium, right? And this notion that film is an immersive medium that can sort of like in which we can encounter some of these either forces or philosophical dilemmas and so on and so forth. I would say, just to be brutally honest, that the first, maybe not the only reason, but the first reason I engaged with film was probably a little bit strategic. Apart from my personal preference and admiration for films, I would consider myself a film buff. But nobody had sort of filled that specific gap. So in that sense, there was a strategic choice in trying to write about something that nobody so far had written about. Of course, I have a background in English studies, and so literature is also right there next to radio drama and computer games. But Suzanne Morrison has already written a very excellent monograph on the topic of literature, of waste in literature. So I directed my attention to film for that reason. But in terms of I guess the more conceptual argument for looking into film, I have to admit that recently I've become a little bit torn when it comes to this sort of like discussion of the affordance of immersion, because on the one hand, yes, it does bring us into close proximity with some of these dilemmas, but increasingly I've also begun to wonder whether or not immersion is always good, right? Whether or not immersion can also be very problematic. They can lend you to uncritically adopt the sort of like overarching ideology of the film world or the gaming world or the radio drama that you enter. So I'm I'm actually a little bit in doubt what to do about immersion, because it seems to me easy to argue for the importance and the problems associated with that specific part of aesthetic experience. But maybe we can talk more about that in a moment. Your third question about situating this sort of research within the broader broader disciplinary context, what's new about it in essence? What does this PhD tell us that we don't already know? And you bring up Tina Kendall and Chang, both excellent scholars that I admire a lot, and that I also draw upon in the research. Specifically in terms of, I guess Chang has written I think it's a book chapter in the anthology called Eco-Documentaries, where she engages with topics of post-humanism in the short documentary called E-Wasteland by David Fadell. And in it, she sort of discusses some of these, in a way, she offers a conventional eco-cinematic analysis of this documentary, noting some of the tendencies that seem to be promising in terms of cultivating these that might hold some affordance in terms of cultivating ecological perception or something like that in the viewer, right? And I guess my contribution to that would be that I sort of try to see if that's true in terms of the empirical study anyways, because the film that Chang discusses, E-Wasteland, is an observational documentary that just films how these people are sort of, I think the film takes place in Ghana, and you have these subjects burning e-waste in order to extract some of the minerals, but he never engages with the subject itself. He's just filming. And the same thing is the case in Plastic China that I analyze empirically. And so in a way, I found myself agreeing with Chang that this observational mode, she claims that the observational mode sort of has this particular potential in terms of inviting the viewer to reflect on the implications of consumer culture as you watch these old iPhones and screens being burned and dismantled. And so in the Plastic China article, I sort of like try to show a film that does exactly that, not E-Wasteland, but Plastic China, and then sort of like try to interview and talk with some of these viewers about what it was like watching that and how they could make sense of it. And there are both, some of the interviews revealed that there, in as much as it did foster this sort of reflection specifically that Chang talks about it did, like, of course, it starts these reflections about consumer culture, but it also left some viewers frustrated. They felt that because they're so used to watching expository documentaries that tell them what to think or tell them the facts that gives it to them straight, right? They were frustrated with the absence of data or with the absence of a voiceover. So these sort of like observational modes also have very clear limitations when it comes to engaging some of these fields. And so I would say that might be one contribution to that particular field or that particular question. Regarding Tina Kendall, I've read her excellent article on, I forget what it's called now, Trash Humpers, a film about sort of like a trash cinema. She also calls it trash cinema, right? Sort of a celebration of trashiness. She also discusses, of course, Varda's documentary, The Gleaners and I. I guess a little bit akin to your own work, John, maybe I could say that one of my contributions is that I perhaps focus less on art house cinema and more on mainstream media. Of course, Plastic China might not be the best example of mainstream media, but anyways, some of the other articles engage with that. So I guess I would say that I sort of try to bring some of this attention to more of a mainstream context and mainstream texts. Right. The fourth question you asked, the fourth marker the thing that struck you, as you put it, was this strange correlation. You mentioned the science fiction article where I engaged with Idiocracy and with Blade Runner and with District 9, and there's this sort of like strange connection between the presence of waste in some of these films and the processes of change, or these sort of like epistemologically rupturing potentials of trash as sort of a marker of hybridity and so on. I think District 9 is a good example of it, precisely because whenever Vandermeer goes into the so-called shanty towns, that is the area where he undergoes this transformation. And I guess initially the article was much broader. There was actually 9 films in the article that had. So reviewer 2 told me to remove 6 articles and then 6 films and engage with only 3. But there seems to be a tendency, not only that waste is sort of like there in a lot of popular culture films and so on, there also seems to be this tendency where the parts of the film, usually as the hero sort of goes out and undergoes this transformation, those areas or those settings are very often wastelands. They're very often these places where trash is found everywhere, and this is sort of like some of the transformations of the various characters tend to be undertaken within settings that are wasteful, or that are filled with waste. Right. Another example that comes to mind is I think it's the second last Avengers film, where they end up on a trash planet, which is also this sort of like place where they sort of like battle some of their moral sort of questions and some of the transformations that allow them to go back and save the world and so on. And so I guess I'm trying to sort of write forth this idea that change appear to occur within the proximity of waste when it's placed within some of these cinematic landscapes. I'm not sure that, maybe I'm underselling myself in a way, but I'm not sure I'm totally convinced by my own argument. But it's just an observation that I feel like is too sort of like curious not to probe further. And my best answer is that there is that correlation, because that is a principal feature of waste itself, namely its formlessness, this marker of transience, as Boscaia calls it in stuff theory, that it is this sort of like hybrid thing that used to be a thing but no longer a thing, but it might be recuperated into becoming a thing, and so on and so forth. And so the same appears to be happening to some of the subjects that inhabit those areas. Right. Let me see here, your 5th question about article number 4 was about some of these problems with humor, or the potential in humor, and some of the problems in satire specifically, that you point out, that I engage with Idiocracy. I must admit that I hadn't thought so much about it, because I used Idiocracy, I guess, for another purpose than to emphasize its strategy of humor. And then I guess, yeah, also just to be brutally honest again, the science fiction article was written much earlier in my project, and now I'm engaging with humor, so I guess I wasn't really attentive to those things back then. But yeah, much could be written, and people have written about the sort of like estrangement offered in Idiocracy. What's her name? The lady who wrote Bad Environmentalism, Nicole Seymour, notably has engaged with this film, and also in fact lamented the absence of scholarship with this film. She has this like bit where she talks about like why nobody's talking about this film. It's brilliant. Why is this not this on everybody's tongue, right? I think, yeah, I could say more about that, I guess, but I would also like to move into a more of a dialogue based part of the seminar. I guess one thing to say about the notion of estrangement with regards to Idiocracy was the sort of like observation that Seymour also makes in Bad Environmentalism, is the fact that when Donald Trump was elected for president, there was a petition to recategorize Idiocracy from being a fiction film to being a documentary, which I thought was by itself also pretty funny. But also sort of like, I guess, dealing with some of these epistemological potentials for defamiliarization or estrangement in a way. And yeah, your last question about spectacle and narrativity, whether one has primacy over the other. As an empirical eco-critic, I would be very tentative to to make any judgments with regards to that without further sort of like studying how different viewer dispositions engage with some of these concepts. But I guess at the moment that I bring up spectacle and narrative and also symbolism in the science fiction article, of course I lean on Ivakiv's sort of like tripartite model, where he also delineates those three. And I guess I'm assuming that he would say that they mutually reinforce each other. I think he goes into length about some of these ways in which the different aspects of the film experience can sort of like feed into and reinforce one another. The spectacle only takes on a truly effective force once you, through narrative, are engaged in that character because you know what's at stake and so on and so forth. So I think that would be my attempt at an answer. So yeah, standing tall on the notion of hybridity, I guess. Yeah.
I'm conscious of time and of course letting other questions come up. I think there may be one or two things on there from looking at the tabs. But just very quickly, Nicolai, I mean, thank you. That was really helpful, and I've really erased a lot of those points so that you can sort of think them through in order to clarify them in your introduction and so on. But I really liked your comment about your skepticism about the immersive experience and how useful it is, and it kind of got me thinking that actually one of the things your dissertation I think is already doing, but could even do even more, is to sort of address this question about, well, what's best? Is it best to give viewers an immersive experience in terms of addressing these questions? Is it best to give viewers an immersive experience? Is it best to have a bit of critical distance so that we actually become critical, even to a point of criticizing? Where is the right balance in these things? And something which occurred to me when I was reading your stuff before, and I'm not sure this is a particularly helpful suggestion when you've got 6 months left, is that I think reception study is a really good idea, but receiving a documentary is very different from receiving a fictional film. And I think at some point, whether in the PhD or at some point after the PhD, repeating your exercise on plastic china to see how people receive fictional narratives as well, and how much they stay with them. Because as you say, and as others have said before, plastic china may impact on someone quite heavily, for a few days, and then it sort of it kind of fades away fairly quickly. I think others have found the same thing. Be interesting to see if fictional narratives have a stronger hold on people's minds and attitudes. yeah, this late into PhD, I'm not so sure, but it's definitely something to think about in terms of future work.
Definitely. Yeah. Thank you for that suggestion. It's definitely also one of the articles I'm the happiest with, that I included, that I thought was a bit daunting in the beginning to engage in, because I'm just trained as an English student, and then I have a minor in philosophy, so I know nothing. To undertake some of that, I had to attend PhD courses on how to do qualitative interviewing and all this stuff to sort of like try to engage with it, but it also is very time consuming. So had I only known at the beginning of the PhD, but then again, I wouldn't have written some of the other stuff, I guess. But
you're very brave, because I keep thinking about doing it, because I've read all these people saying it needs to be done in ecomedia studies. You've actually gone and done it, which is really laudable.
There is this sort of like daunting feeling at the beginning of it for sure, and there is also like there are a lot of problems with it, definitely. I mean, in terms of methodological restrictions, I use qualitative interviewing, and of course one of the principal challenges of that, and as I note in the article as well, is that self-report is the validity of self-report is an open question, or maybe not even an open question. Maybe it is not reliable in a way, right? I guess my way around that was to sort of like just emphasize that these are the words that the participants choose to use, and that they have in the vocabulary to describe their experience and make sense of it, and that does have an impact. But of course, it's not the whole picture, and there may be things that they're remembering wrong, or there may be parts of the experience that wasn't even really something that was available to consciousness, at least at the point that I wrote that I did the study. I was kind of deep into a sort of affect theory, and sort of like trying to police this distinction between emotion and affect, and sort of just come to the conclusion that this reception study certainly has nothing to do with affect, other than it has something to do with emotions. Because there's no way I can research. There's no way that I, as at least an interviewer or conversation partner, can grasp that. So there's also all sorts of different empirical methods, right? And I really like the qualitative one, because it really to get a full picture of some of the paradigms.
I think you're right, and I think the question of what you said, people remember things wrongly, I think is a really significant thing in itself. I don't know if you know, have a media theorist, Sonia Livingstone, very, very big name in sort of media studies, did some work a few years ago where she got people to recite back the storyline of a soap opera around adultery. They'd make all sorts of things up, which didn't happen in the storyline, and what you can find out as a result of that is really rich.
Right. Yeah.
I think you're on exactly right lines here.
Hi, Peter.
All right. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Nicolai, and thanks, John. That was a very useful and illuminating exchange for you and for the rest of us. I think there's much food for further thought there. You haven't wasted time, but we're running out of time anyway. We do have a few minutes left. So maybe we can just take the one question that's there in the chat. I don't know if people can see that, but I'll try to paraphrase. Nicolai, it's a question that has to do with popularity and the notion of the popular. Right? You range across some very different media projects in your work, right? Some of which are Hollywood blockbusters, and others are sort of relatively obscure things that you found on YouTube. Or so what is popularity? To what extent is that a factor? Given that you want to talk about affect and you want to talk about what you call the power of texts, and maybe you can also tie that to something that you don't talk about so much, but that I know you're interested in, which has to do with the material effects of media products, right? Something like Blade Runner 2049 was probably seen by hundreds of millions of people, right, who all take their cars and drive to the movie theaters and consume beverages. what can we, to what extent is that something that we also need to look into?
I think I'll start with your last point, and also admit that that's a huge problem in terms of ecologies of cinema. The cinematic footprint, which has been discussed extensively throughout the past 5-10 years, represents a huge industry that potentially. I say I don't focus on that in a footnote, but if I really did take that seriously, I will have to admit that it in a way could undermine the entire dissertation in its argument from that sort of like practical perspective, and thus perhaps situate the project more in the realms of like sort of cultural analysis and how we make sense of crisis, as opposed to analysis of activist art forms in a way, because the media complex is a huge machine that has a huge imprint, right? The recent Ale conference, I saw Stephen Rost's presentation on just the process of acquiring funding for a film that goes before the production itself. Involves flying around the world to go to galas and go to parties and do all this stuff, right? That takes place behind the scenes, and so that's a huge problem that definitely needs to be reckoned with. And scholars have reckoned with, or not reckoned with, but written about it, right, and discussed it. I've chosen. So
popularity is a double-edged sword.
Yeah,
at the very least.
In a way, I guess so that's one way of responding to it, to acknowledge, yes, that is a huge problem in terms of the choice in films that make up my corpus of analytical objects in relation to my claim that these films can do things or has the potential to do things. I think I have to sort of like fall back on some idea that there are varying affordances associated with different types of media products that circulate in different cultural spheres, and in more than one way, not only in terms of the ways in which viewers watch a film like Agnes Varda's The Gleaner is Nigh and start to reflect on their own relationally embeddedness in the material world and so on. And then people who watch Blade Runner, who may or may not develop this sort of like cultural and social and ecological mindset upon doing so. But in another way, I guess you could also sort of argue that, and I think scholars have argued that some of these sort of more avant-gardist trends in cinema tends to sort of like trickle down into mainstream media and become part of its sort of like aesthetic apparatus, its strategies and so on and so forth, right? That when experimental filmmakers try something new, and if it has an interesting effect, maybe other filmmakers will see that and try to sort of utilize that in the more sort of like mainstream iterations. Yeah, I think that would be my response, but yeah, a huge problem.
John, do you want to weigh in here? You have written extensively about popular culture and the notion of the popular.
I'm not sure I've got anything particular to add to what Nicolai has already said, to be honest. I mean, it's the kind of elephant in the room almost, isn't it? I need to ask Nicolai a question about this, is that you used, so I've got this written down somewhere, Lopez's terms about ecomedia footprint and ecomedia mindprint, and, how you balance the good, I suppose, that film can do in this sense, in terms of getting people to think differently, helping people to think differently with a material impact, which you can't deny is fairly catastrophic. As you say, Stephen Russ's paper adds a whole new dimension to this, over and above the film itself. It's an age-old debate, isn't it? Is that, we're in such dire straits, ecologically speaking, but you've got to engage the mass of the public. And I've written about my own experiences in class. I show The Day After Tomorrow, and you get half a class saying this is absolute rubbish, and it's cost loads of money and used loads of resources to make it. And you get the other half a class where people literally say things like, oh my God, I'd never thought about these issues before. They're terrible. You know, what can I do to save them? So, you know, these films make a massive difference to a certain segment of society. But somehow you've got to balance, the two things together.
All right. Thanks a lot for that. And thanks a lot again to both of you for this very interesting exchange. I think it's 3:30 now. Nicolai, do we have a break at this point?
Yeah, I guess all that's left to say is thank you, John, and Peter for moderating, and thank you, John, for your very sort of thoughtful and also extensive response to the PhD. I really enjoyed the exchange, and hope to talk more in the future.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you for the invitation. It's great. Enjoyed it.